Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Before I formally start, before I hand over to Mohammed, just want to allow people into the room first. We're expecting a full house, over 100 to 200 people today for the next hour or so. So we just want to make sure, some housekeeping rules before we start. Just kind reminder, if not already, please keep your phones or your devices on mute. It is muted automatically as you come in, but just in case, do try and keep it on mute. If you are using a live video showing your face, that's fine, not a problem. You can replace it with a photo, whatever's easy for you. It is being recorded, so if you're not registered, please leave your email address here to receive a copy after we have permission from Dr. Hallaq who's going to review it and see it. And there is a Q&A session at the end. Please write all questions down here or so. So just a few more, about a minute before we start. I just want to make sure everyone comes in, settle down. Okay, so Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Islamic Courses session titled Book Review, Reforming Modernity, Ethics and the New Human in the Philosophy of Abdurrahman Taha, with our dear respected teacher and author, Professor Wael from Columbia University. And it's hosted by our dear friend and teacher, Dr. Mohammed, Hashas, who is from the Fondazione della Scienze, Religiose in Italy. Before I hand over to Mohammed, just a reminder of housekeeping rules. Please keep your phones or devices on mute. It is being recorded, so if you're not registered, leave your email address on the chat. And there is a Q&A session. Please, again, write your questions on the chat. So we haven't got much time because it's only an hour. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Mohammed. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Mizan. Thank you very much to the organizers, Islamic Courses. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on the time zone where you are in. I am very pleased, very honored to be in this session today with Professor Wael Hallaq, who I do not need to introduce. He's professor of Islamic law and Islamic intellectual history at Columbia University. His books have been translated in many languages. And today we'll be talking about his latest book, Reforming Modernity, Ethics and the New Human in the Philosophy of Abdurrahman Taha, or Taha Abdurrahman, as is also known in the publishing circles in the Arab world. I should say, and this should be confirmed by Professor Hallaq, that this book could be considered a sequel to his recent other two books, The Impossible State of 2013 and the Restating Modernity of 2018. Professor Wael Hallaq, I hope you are coping well with this pandemic, which we hope will end soon. And please tell us something of how you are first before we proceed and discuss the book.
Sorry, I did not hear the last few words.
Tell us how you are now in dealing with the pandemic. We hope you are fine. You and your
Alhamdulillah, it has been an experience like for everyone else. But yes, I have so far escaped the disaster personally. So I'm hoping that we can all get out of this with less damage and minimal damage, if that is conceivable at all.
Good. To introduce to the audience that are not familiar yet, we have not read the book yet. How did you arrive to the work of Taha Abdurrahman? In the book you say by coming across his work in PES in 2002, and was there kind of search for an intellectual figure or philosophy of this kind, or is there kind of intellectual coincidence, or there is something that you have been looking for since you worked on a Muslim logician of the medieval, which is Ibn Taymiyyah, and on whom you published in the mid-1990s. Tell us something about this coincidence or reading of Taha Abdurrahman.
Well, it's difficult sometimes to self-diagnose, to think at yourself and see how you arrived at something. All you can do is try to see the major trends that perhaps made the very idea of finding his book in a bookshop so interesting, and that having not heard of him before, I pick up this book from, like I did about 30 books before in that bookshop in Fez. And that one basically was the only one that struck me as just I began to read a few paragraphs there while standing next to the shelf.
Which book was it?
Sorry?
Which book was that exactly?
سؤال الأخلاق.
Question.
That 5 minutes, 10 minutes, the question becomes why I have just picked up 30 books, looked at them and put them back on the shelves. Why this one attracted my attention so much that I quickly went to the cashier, paid for it, and looked around, and I found 5 meters away from the bookshop a cafe. I sat in the cafe, ordered a nos, and actually started reading the book. So the question is, what made this book suddenly so important? I mean, of course, here you in my mind. So of course, here you have to dig deep into what I find relevant and what not, what ticks my imagination, what doesn't. And on the whole, what made me continue reading Taha after this, trying to procure all his works and reading everything I could get my hands on. And then eventually, that's the third stage, is to decide at one point that in fact he is worth writing a book about. So there are many elements here. I would say that, of course, there is something, and this answers probably some of the questions that that the audience may have in their minds, is whether I think, at least, if not, if the question can be asked also in broader terms, if Taha is unique, so to speak. Well, first, we don't really have to write a book about just unique people, but it so happened that Taha is, in my opinion, is to some good extent a unique thinker in the Arab world today. And one of the aspects of this uniqueness is his relentless emphasis on the ethical. That aspect, sorry, that aspect that has been most neglected. If we were to take human intellectual thought, at least insofar as I know it, from basically mostly from the Indians and some from the Chinese and the Muslims for over centuries and centuries, down, and of course the Greeks and the ethical element, in philosophy or ethics as a significant component of a human thinking has always been prominent. And suddenly now we see, after basically the 17th century, with Machiavelli, Hobbes, and the rest of them, we see a beginning of a departure, and then a separation between the ethical and the factual, so to speak, between fact and value. Well, Taha's work is in a sense unique because he goes against the grain of modern thinking, where the ethical not only is inseparable from the factual, meaning here the fact as distinct from value, but also makes the ethical the leader of thinking, meaning that moral and ethical philosophy must be seen as the, so to speak, as some earlier philosophers put it, the mother of all sciences, so to speak.
Yeah.
And this is not an academic statement. It is actually an epistemological statement, in the sense that it makes epistemology, everything that we know and how we know things, drastically different from another epistemology, such as the modern one.
Okay, so stating this, seeing that ethics is the corner or the hard element in the philosophy of Taha Abdurrahman, does this make him turn? Is it because of this claim that he launches strong criticism of the classical or the ancients and modern, be they Western or Greek, or modern, be they Arab, Muslim, or Euro-American? It's making ethics the corner or the principle of every act and thinking in philosophy. And so in that sense, he builds his epistemology in Islamic ontological understanding of human being and creation and cosmology. And this goes against a trend that is dominant or has been dominant in Islamic studies in modern times, which is that there has been no independent discipline of Islamic ethics. So, and here comes your work, the precedent ones and this current book, and maybe that's where you meet with Taha Abdurrahman, is that all Sharia, or Sharia as a worldview, is ethical. So the paradigm is ethical, and his aim with this work, with making ethics the center, is to claim a paradigm that is lost or in the process of being lost. Is it how we understand it? And is it how we understand your critique of one of the most read and scholars in the Arab world, which is Al-Jabri, for example, and your also dismissal of nearly all other Arab and Muslim thinkers of modern times, apart from few ones like Abdul Wahab al-Masiri and partly Nasif Nassar. Al-Masiri is Egyptian and Nassar is Lebanese. So these are the few exceptions you refer to. And maybe we can refer to Fazlur Rahman and Iqbal as exceptions also, but I leave it with this thought and see your reaction. Has been there really a lack of discipline, a clear discipline of Islamic ethics in Islamic scholarship, past and present?
Well, there are many questions here. Actually, this is like quite now a bit daunting to even now to come back and write the questions down that are supposed to be under one question, Mohammed. So we'll take them. We'll take some of them.
We have problem of audio, please.
Sorry.
We cannot hear you. Yes, now, yes.
Yeah, we can hear him now. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not sure where to start with these, because now, as I said, there are not only many questions, but they are not necessarily all kind of that connect with each other or follow from each other directly. So I cannot even answer them as a series. But let me try. First, I suppose one of the questions that you posed in the beginning was that how do I situate Taha in vis-a-vis the Muslim thinkers, the
yes.
pre-modern Muslim thinkers? Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. Can we, since you bring a critique of Al-Jabri in the introduction of your book, shall we think of typology of Mashriq Maghrib intellectual thinking, or maybe think of another typology like the traditionalists, the mimetics, and the innovatives, and where do we put Taha Abdurrahman?
Well, do we? Well, again, I'm not a bit hesitant to put people in boxes and spots. There are, of course, movements, and sometimes, in fact, we can say that people are artificially actually labeled as, for example, within this, you can speak about Scottish Enlightenment or French Enlightenment and such. These things, I'm not sure I'm convinced of such labelings. The Jabiri's Mashriq Maghrib distinction is highly chauvinistic. I will put it to you just right out. It is not based on any careful thinking of what makes for a category as a discrete category or another. His use of Arab is highly problematic because the concept of Arab as such is not was never an analytical category before the 19th century, including, of course, that means now Persian and whatnot, because he in fact also launches a highly chauvinistic critique of the Persian influence on Islamic culture. I don't see the world the way Jabiri does. I am no less of a specialist of Islamic studies, as they are called. There is here a fundamental problem with Jabiri's conception of what Islam was, to be honest with you. I don't think that he was a massive encyclopedic reader, but I don't think that his reading, the scope of his reading was matched by a thorough and deep reading of or understanding of what he was reading. In fact, as I show in the introduction in mere few pages, Jabiri committed some major contradictions and problems in his works, especially the ethical works. So I wouldn't put Taha and his work in any of these frames. He's not even just a Muslim thinker or a Muslim philosopher. I don't treat him as such only. He is, to me, a Muslim thinker up to a point. But I do not think it is wise for us to treat these major voices, including Jabiri here, however erroneous he was on many issues, and unaware of their implications. I wouldn't treat them just as Arab or Islamic thinkers. I would like to the same way from my podium here at Columbia, I see that all these luminaries, those considerate, elaborate, highly perceptive, intelligent thinkers, who, wherever they come from, are part of a larger network of thinking that is all intermingling and overlapping. So this is why I wrote The Impossible State in the first place, is not just to critique certain theses, prevalent theses, but also to say that there, for example, that on some on important points of our life, Islam has lots to say, and that is to be brought into the table of discussion of academia everywhere in the West or the East. Islam is not just some external entity that we study and leave on the side as if he's a Muslim thinker or Arab, and we leave them there, where we pick them from there and put them right back there, without really making these people challenge the core and the center of our thinking in the metropolis, that is the Western metropolis. That is one thing that I try to do in the book here, is to bring Taha's voice and the whole problematics of the Nahda and the reformation, so to speak, or rethinking of Islamic Arab culture up to this point, to bring it as a problem on equal to all other problems on the Western academic table. So I would like to see in Taha as a participant in the debates about modernity. Hence, notice the title, Reforming Modernity, no less. It's a very ambitious title. Yeah, so I wanted I treat him not as a Maghribi philosopher. He happened to come from Morocco with a certain Moroccan background, and perhaps things happened to be Moroccan that gave impetus to his work. but the final song he sang doesn't just belong to Morocco. It belongs to the world, and the world needs to hear about it.
Okay, good. So this, by implication, you have answered my next point. So the division that among some scholars in North Africa or the whole Maghreb, Arab world, of neo-Averroïsts or neo-Ghazalis is erroneous also from my reading of the understanding, right? So, and calling Abdurrahman a neo-Ghazali is also erroneous. It doesn't do him justice, right?
That is exactly the case. To say neo, you have to first define what the word means. You can use any word to describe anything. You can say you can use the most actually unusual terminology, as long as you define what you mean by them. If you mean by neo that he replicates Ghazali and just adjusts Ghazali in a modern context, so to speak, that's one meaning of neo. But if you say that he expropriates Ghazali in order to create a dent in a modern context or in modernity, that's another meaning of neo, which is also acceptable. So it depends what you mean by that. To me, Taha is a complex thinker in many ways, in many meanings. But one meaning is that he does not rely on one or two major thinkers to elaborate his philosophy. His sources are multiple. And in fact, I would say, to answer perhaps another question that may be anticipated, Mohammed, is that in fact his sources are not exclusively Islamic either, which makes him a great interlocutor with modernity and modernists. Because, for example, the French schools, and that happened, it is not a coincidence that he is a Francophone. The French schools, the critical schools such as the philosophical and sociological schools that begin with Durkheim and on until now, and of course the German 20th century and 21st century luminaries, have contributed to his elaboration of what is essentially, if we may use the term, of what is essentially an Islamic conception of life. So it is undeniable that his aura is Islamic, but his solutions can be actually solutions for modernity as well. What I took from Taha, although he doesn't elaborated in these terms, he doesn't go that far in the sense of naming names, but I thought it might be useful to name names on his behalf, is to say that in fact what is at stake is as Foucault would make it, the center of his project. What is at stake here is the subject.
Yeah,
there's nothing more important than the subject in all of this. It is about us. It's about who we are.
Yeah,
and that is the center of his philosophy, I think, and the center of any philosophy that really cares to approach modernity with a very critical eye.
Yeah. I will turn to that in a while when we speak about the new man and its principles or major principles. But let's bring Abdurrahman in communication with his own tradition first. Who are the closest to him for our audience in your thinking? And in some of his work, he says that often traditional scholars, Usuliyin, they did not focalize ethics as the core of the message. They made it always in parallel with, and they made it secondary to law. And he, in some of his works, he gives a new order to values instead of the 5 major principles or kulliyat al-khams, etc. Do you think that this is revolutionary, or this is kind of an intellectual exercise that is influenced by the modern context in any way, though it always brings the tradition and links his work to Al-Shatibi, to also his favorites are Al-Ghazali, of course, and the innovative attempts of Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Shatibi, etc. But tell us something about this link or this rereading of the tradition and his focus of ethics. In other words, what does ethics mean in modern times for Muslim living in secular or secularizing societies?
Well, it's almost it's almost a given that there is nothing that Taha can say that is not modern. He's situated in modernity, and even if he invokes a non-modern idea or subject, meaning non-modern here, of course, pre-modern, but the pre disturbs me sometimes. It might be much more objective to say non-modern or extra-modern. The invocation of any non-modern idea is in itself a modern phenomenon. Taha's engagement with Ghazali is not very different from Taha's engagement with Habermas, for example, because what he is doing is basically taking certain ideas and spinning them in the way he sees fit for his own purposes. Everybody does this, by the way, whether consciously or not, and whether there are names or not. But the Taha here is acting as a restorer of this distinction. He does speak about it, I think, in Su'al al-Akhlaq. He does speak about it in some pages, between a few to a dozen or so. And he has read Hume about Hume's distinction about the ought distinction, fact value. But for him, at the end of the day, is really the entire project comes back to this thing which he spoke about in about, let's say, a dozen pages. I haven't counted the pages again. I'm just saying. So the entire project is a restoration of the indistinguishable link that is between these two. And that is where his kind of uniqueness, or I don't want to say revolutionary, because I don't think he went really to tease out the full implications of his own suggestions. This is why at the end, the last chapter in the book is basically to bring about the radicalness in his project, and to bring it about in conjunction with my own thinking about the subject. Because I'm here, the last chapter is basically appropriating, ethically or unethically, appropriating Taha for my own purposes.
Yes,
and I'm of course I'm kidding about, I'm joking about the ethically or not ethically, but the point is that there is an appropriation by my own interests and by my own concerns about my own project in the whole thing, which is to name the final game, which is that the whole search, if it is about rethinking the separation and distinction between is and ought, and the fact value, and these are two different things, by the way. I'm not using them as exchangeable or synonyms. Then it is about really forging the new human, a subject, a performed subject that we are not so far.
Okay. Well, the point of ethics of Abdurrahman is mostly religiously fueled. I mean, it's based on religious ethos. It's more particularly Islamic ethos. And maybe that's why he's not well read, or he is ignored, very critiqued by a lot of so-called secular or liberal Arab scholars. Well, speaking about the Arab world because of the socio-cultural and political situation in the context. But you say that you have read into Abdurrahman outside the Arab world. Maybe that's also my take, is that maybe he could be better understood outside the Arab world, maybe in the West, where the context is not very ideological. Well, it is ideological in a sense, but it's not as polarized as it is in the Arab world. Would you take this as a note to reflect on?
Of course, I would say that one of the worst things for a thinker to maintain is to and this is very predominant in the Arab world, unfortunately, and I find it quite damaging and harmful, is to work with labels. Once you begin to work with labels, you have already set the tone for your next arguments, and you are actually bound by certain presuppositions that already constrain you. Why do we, for example, take Charles Taylor as a major 20th century, 21st century thinker who's read by, his works are translated into almost every major language in the world. Everybody knows Charles Taylor. He is one of the probably 10 major voices in the last 70 years in human history, right? In world history. But nobody thinks of him as, well, you know what, his relevance, his analytical philosophical relevance is limited because he's a Catholic, because he's a Christian, because he's Western. Nobody says this. So why should we say this about Taha Abdurrahman or anyone else, especially Taha Abdurrahman, who is actually not only, he's not even claiming that he's speaking about Muslims alone in a sense. Although he says that sometimes, he says, well, yeah, but I think there is some dualism sometimes in his talk, like double talk in order to kind of not to alienate, but that shouldn't really lead us to believe everything he says about these strategic issues. He wants people to read him, and he wants people to try to get to the core of, and he's trying every rhetorical device possible to not to alienate his readership. That's great. I am all in favor of this. But his project is, I would say, universal in a sense. That he's trying to talk not only to Muslims, he is talking to Muslims about modernity, and in many ways talking to Muslims about the West through the West, and sometimes about the West through the West itself, its own thinkers. The medium is Arabic. That's limiting. Hence, for example, the need to expound his ideas, as I have tried to do, because I think the next stage should be, it's not my project, I have other things to work on. I have done my, so to speak, my share in a sense, insofar as I am concerned in these issues, but there is now a place for a series of books. I would say no less than 2 or 3 dozen books by young, enterprising, smart scholars to dig into the details of his project and bring them out in major languages, not only in Arabic. And that way, once this happens, and this is tragic, very sad, is that only when things get credibility in the West that our Arab and Muslim brothers and sisters begin to believe in the worthwhileness of what has become famous in the West. This is very sad. This is a sign of the lack of self-confidence. We do not need for our scholars to succeed in the West so that they can be believable and can be credible. We should read them ourselves and try to, without political and other labels, which are really dominating the day to day, and that's really another deplorable thing, is without these labels to try to understand what they are saying and take them as ideas, not as names or national national origins, where he's Persian, Arab, Moroccan, or Mashriqi or Maghribi. These things are totally useless. And in fact, not only useless, they are damaging. Once we get to the core of the ideas, we can work with them sometimes, as I have done with Taha and his work. We can work with them as actually world's ideas. ideas that pertain, in as much as they pertain to us, Arabs, Muslims, they pertain not only to the West, but also to the Chinese and the Japanese and others.
Good. My next is related to this. Well, the universal aspect of Taha's projects and its emphasis on ethics. Is he close, by any chance, despite his affiliation to Sufi tradition, Buchishi and Morocco, etc., which is also another reason why he was attacked from the 1990s? Is he close to the Muslims of the West, some of the Muslims of the West who belong to so-called traditional or perennial philosophy? Or no, he remains within, he works or thinks within the classical, traditional, mainstream Sunni orthodoxy? Or you see points of relatedness?
Well, that's a very good question. I did not address it directly in the book. There was so much to say anyway, but I don't see a direct engagement on behalf of Taha with, for example, the prominent followers of the perennial school. Probably he has read them. Most probably he knows about them. Most probably he knows René Guénon. But that's not really always important, whether he read their works or not.
Okay.
It's not about genealogies here, really.
But does not that limit, because his discourse is revelation based, is Quranic based. So his discourse of ethics, it wants to be universal, and he claims it to be universal, as he said. Yes. But it's within or based on the Islamic worldview.
Well, to some extent, Muhammad, to some extent. Okay. But this again is not a limitation.
Okay. Yeah.
The idea of the perennialist school is not a merely Islamic, just Islamic idea. The perennialist school raises a fundamental philosophical question that is actually pertinent to everybody in modernity in particular. Actually, no other phase in human history, insofar as we know the major features of it in the last 5,000 years, has needed this kind of thinking and rethinking as we do today. The perennial school is not about really the Quran. Of course, for Muslims, it will be, because that's what they value as the most important spiritual, psychological, behavioral, and philosophical, and whatever source. It is an all-inclusive importance. But the principles of the school transcend the idea of having only the Quran as the basis of these. You could actually have a traditionalist school, perennial school, or perennial philosophy dominating any country that is not Muslim. Mm-hmm. The idea is not in the Quran. It is the idea here is not about the Quran alone. The idea is that the kind of the idea that is beyond this. Once Muslims are only part of the citizens of this world, or rather denizens of this world, inhabitants of this world. I'm revising my own words because I have a totally utter respect for the concept of citizen. It is highly problematic and actually dangerous. So I would say that Muslims are only part of today's inhabitants of the earth, and therefore the philosophical questions should be of universal, so to speak, relevance, that speak to all people, no matter what faith they are. The idea then is to stick by ethical principles as the dominant and dominating principles, no matter where their source is. It could be the Bible, it could be the Vedas, it could be any book or books, or even non-books, even some kind of writing discursive body of works that speaks about and insists on higher principles that are not to be really played around at will. See, this is the problem of modernity, is that there are no really, besides the principles really of the only fixed principles in modernity are the principles of economics, and to a lesser extent which is still being challenged here and there, is the liberal forms of governance. These are the only ideas that dominate our life with fixity today.
And man, then now I return to your first point of subjectivity and agency, and the relevance of a mechanism or an apparatus that Abdurrahman develops based on his tradition, which is tazkiyah, which I translate as spiritual self-criticism. That's how I wonder if that fits or answers the demands of, let's say, first, think more practically, the Arab context that is in change or looking for change. Within the diversity of voices, of tendencies, ideologies of such a context that sticks to the tradition to a certain level, but at the same time wishes to distance itself from it to move ahead for the well-being of society, for the well-functioning of state apparatus, etc. I wonder if this concept of tazkiyah works, or that's not my only question, but that's a question of political theorists and political philosophers who think in the Arab world or from an Arab perspective. And if this is the case, and it seems difficult for some in the Arab context, it may appear even more so in a non-Arab and non-Islamic context, because at the end, the subjectivity is something that has been centralized, focalized in modernity, but with all what modernity has gone through with capitalism, savage capitalism, neoliberalism, that subject is no longer there actually, or is there to a certain extent. How far do you think this tazkiyah or spiritual self-criticism can function? Because at the end, it's related also to your concept of the new man, which I will go back to again later. But if you want to anticipate that and link it to the principles you outlined about that the new man, which you say is influenced or got inspiration from the work of Taha Abdurrahman, is rejects capitalism, rejects materialism, rejects sovereignty, and search for the formation of a new habitus against the structural genocide, to use your own term, that has happened in Muslim majority societies because classical institutions no longer work. I mean, classical religious institutions that influenced all other spheres until modern times. I mean, through the Waqf institutions, through the establishment of schools, hospitals, public services, etc. So I'm thinking here aloud and also raising the question how this self-criticism or the tazkiyah functions or works, or can it work in complicated societies as the Arab world and also maybe elsewhere. I wonder. I have put a lot of questions here, but before.
Oh no, all right. I mean, there's one important strand in the question that is very it's worth picking on because it raises serious issues insofar as not only what Taha wanted to do, but also what the object of his criticism as well, that which exists in modernity. If you, well, at least the way I see his concept of tazkiyah as being dug really genealogically from his works, not only taking a paragraph where he mentions the term and try to understand its meaning from that paragraph. If you take it structurally across his works, what I think Taha is talking about is an old concept that pervaded so much of self cultivation in human history as far back as the classical Greeks, if not even before. We don't still know much about what the others were doing at the time around 400 BC, when what were the or 1000, 2000 even BC, what were the pharaohs doing with this, with the concept of what Foucault called the care of the self? There's in this debate, the debate as to tazkiyah, the formation of the ethical self, is actually about an old philosophical problem that Foucault would label in one volume hermeneutics of the subject. The hermeneutics of the subject is worthwhile reading in this context, because it tells us about a long history that even predates the Islamic practice of let's say Sufism and other, or Zuhd, whatever. It doesn't mean that Greece, that's an important, it doesn't mean that Greece is the cradle of such practices. In fact, it is more likely that Greece simply continued a tradition that was cultivated in what we call today the Egypto-Levant, as we know from other attempts at seeing Greece as part of this whole constellation of intellectual, religious, spiritual world. So tazkiyah is a concept that continues with us from most ancient times through Islam as the continuer of major civilizational constellations, displacing the Byzantines and the Byzantines, and basically, and the Romans even, the Egyptian province and the Fertile Crescent, all of it, and to some extent also the Persian Empire, displacing it with a way of with a new way of, not a new, but a continuing, fresh, vigorous way that was always evolving insofar as the care of the self is concerned. So we cannot really understand Taha's work. We cannot understand the entire, actually, Greek traditional works from Aristotle to Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, and at least a number of Greek schools, without understanding how the care of the self was central to thinking, not only in philosophy as a theoretical discipline, but more importantly, how it is an integral part of cultivating the human subject as a particular kind of subject. And this runs through the entirety of what I call the Mediterranean basin, because it runs from, and even beyond, of course, it runs from Iraq to Spain in pre-Islamic times, for sure, that we know this for sure, and it later on runs through Islam in the whole region that Islam occupied, from South Asia and the Malayas to Spain, and then later becomes, of course, part of the pre-modern, pre-Renaissance, even European way of life. So the tazkiyah is not something really new, and to be honest with you, only the details might be, some details might be specifically Islamic.
But the point that he gives it a very Sufi orientation, makes readers look at it as submissive form of forming subjects in societies.
Let's stop here, because there are too many questions at each time. Each 5 words you say, Mohammed, are such loaded with wisdom that we need to stop at these numbers of words and answer them. There is nothing more dangerous than forming in a subject that is not, for example, the subject of the citizen in a modern state, Islamic or not. That's not really, the state is a state. All of them function, roughly speaking, in the same way. They create the citizen. They create particular things. And if you get, and this is where I misunderstand, Taha is very subtle on this. I understand very well that he is operating within tremendous political constraints.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to be penalized for his intellectual projects because he makes some rash statements about politics within Morocco. That is understandable, but doesn't mean that we will dismiss this crucial fact, because it's a fact that is part of the reading of his text. Once I know that you are trying to tell me something, but you are afraid to tell me everything in explicit terms, I have to interpret your works in light of this fact. It's not just a factual fact, so to speak, a little thing on the side. It is actually crucial for the operation of interpretation. And that's why we need to understand Taha and listen to him very carefully when it comes to what does it mean to have a new form of governance? What does it mean to have a Sufi subject? It is actually, in many ways, it is an extremely radical departure from the rest of Muslim thinking here about in that sense, every thinking in a sense. I mean, maybe some Buddhists are doing something I'm not aware of, but I don't see it in the West. I don't see it in the liberal Arab thinking world. What Taha is saying is that I want actually to displace the modern citizen state subject with a spiritual subject whose ethics themselves are a mode of governance. Actually, his project, if I may say, his project is supremely political. I don't want to get him in trouble, but he hasn't said anything really dangerous. It's only my interpretation of his work. But his project is quite radical. He is really searching, and this is why I insist at the end of the book to say, listen, this is what I think, and I think Taha thinks the same thing with me, more or less. That there is the ultimate stake is really to rethink who we are as subjects and to try to imagine what is the human subject that should come about. In the case of Taha, it is an Islamic subject. Mm-hmm. In my case as well, what makes for a prospective Islamic subject that is not caught up in this modern disaster that is wreaking havoc everywhere, and it is proper that I should speak with such strong language in the age of the virus. This is not just a natural pandemic. There are so many modern things going on here that need to be excavated.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. The radicalization of the concept of his tazkiyah can be read differently, as you said, because he underlines the non-violence, the apolitical aspect of it. But then, as you said, it's a different reading.
Mohammed, can we start? We've got about less than 10 minutes, so we can take questions from the floor.
I have to stop. My last question is, what is your major criticism of the project of Taha? And then we pick up some questions. Some of them are already have been posed by me in different forms. Yeah. But my last direct question is, what is your major criticism of Taha's work?
Major here is never in this case. I think almost all my work, when I say major criticism of somebody, that means that I'm going for their jugular vein. But not in the case of Taha. Major in the case of Taha is not about any constitutive element. That is, it's not the backbone or the heart or the mind of his project. I agree with him largely on the essentials. But I think that he started from and was bound by certain presuppositions that I thought he would have done better not sticking by them. And one of them, and probably it's due because he started his projects much earlier, before the radical ways of thinking entered the academic intellectual scenes. For what he was doing in the beginning, that is quite remarkable. But he allowed himself to be caught in the webs of for example, such thinkers as Kant. In many ways, he departs from Kant when he talks about ruh al-hadatha, etc. And this is where he responds to me in the end of the book. Responds to me at the end of the book. I do have an appendix where he writes countering my own critique of his work in the book. And in chapter 2, I do respond to his response as well. So we have, in fact, the book is also, for those who have not read it, the book also is not just a book about him, but also it is in part a dialogue with him. So I write the book, he reads it, and responds to it, and I respond to the response, and everything gets published, and there is an appendix with his own original Arabic letter or response. So there is no real, but I would say that the definition of modernity, according to Kant, in a sense, what is really hadatha, is a big error that should not have been committed. He was bound by, because it is so foundational, he was bound with it later and tried to free himself of it. But I don't think that he succeeded terribly. This is where we could enter into a deeper argument, but that's not
great. Some of the questions that arrived to me here.
Yeah, can we take a question from Harold Veerson? I think is that okay? Let me just unmute him very quickly. Harold, yeah.
Hi.
Yes, go ahead.
It was that the first or the second question you were referring to?
The second question, yeah.
Right. Well, thank you, first of all, Mohammed, for organizing it. This get-together, it was very enjoyable. My question to Mr. Hallaq is, in your book, Restating Orientalism, you critique, amongst other things, the modern theology of progress that dominates contemporary Western thought. This theology of progress implies a certain kind of linear conception of time. Would you say that Taha, in his critique of Western modernity, articulates a different non-linear conception of time? And if so, does such an alternative conception of time relate to what you, following Taha, refer to as ethical time?
Thank you.
Well, yeah, I think I said not enough, never enough, but a lot about his conception of time as ethical time, and I agree with him about this. The linear concept of time is quite ideological, formed as a theology within a particular cultural and political, mainly actually political formation, more than even later becomes cultural. People have not yet understood the significance and the implications of this linear conception of time. So he comes, one of his valuable contributions to this issue and in his own work is to highlight the different conception of an ethical time, that it's not really about time. There is no such thing, that there is nothing important about anything that we do today just because it happened to be in the 21st century. There might be things that happened 5, 7, 10, 15 centuries ago that are actually heuristically, at least, much more valuable. And when we say heuristically, the ethical gains a huge door to enter into the debate. Because once you say history can be heuristic, not mere preparing step for the next step, it's a matter of cause and effect. Then what you are saying is that I can learn from something that happened 2,000 years ago. It doesn't mean that you can replicate that thing and the institutions that arose around that thing in that culture, but it means that it can teach you something. And in fact, all the critique that is worthwhile in modernity, such as Alasdair MacIntyre's and Charles Taylor's and others, is really based and derives its inspiration not from any call to reenact history and to bring back historical institutions. This is like something that is inconceivable to me, actually utterly mad. But rather to learn from others. Just because we sit in the 21st century, it doesn't mean that we are more perceptive or wiser, in particular, wiser than people who lived literally 2,500 years ago.
Good. There is one question from Mohammed Zaki. He says, well, you have replied in a way. Do Taha's political ideas resonate to Hallaq's thesis of impossible state, and how and up to what extent?
I would say, I mean, we dealt with the problem in very different terms.
Mm-hmm.
Not only because I wrote the book in English and he wrote his Ruh al-Din and others in Arabic. It's because the approach and the points of entry of his and mine were very different. But I would say, yes, there is some resemblance, but you have to ask him whether he agrees with the impossible state fully or partially, and how. I really don't know. I think he likes it, that from what I understand, but of course I know Taha well enough to know that there is nothing that anyone can say without him always making a qualification here and there, as I do myself. So it is. But I think we agree generally on the idea. Yes.
There is one question. Have you met Taha Abdurrahman? Do you plan that there will be a sequel to your current work, and which is part of the other two previous works, which is then now the third? Is there fourth and fifth? Is there more engagement?
Well, I never say really. I should now, by now in my age, I should never say, you know, I'm done with the subject. I would like to say, yes, I did the whole book now and it just came out. I don't have any project to write about Taha. I have other projects that continue. They continue even, in a sense, our own projects, his and mine. But in line of what we just said, because the next book I'm working on is really about the concept of politics and the constitutionalism in Islam up to the 19th century. So that is actually a massive kind of project, and I don't know when even if I can complete it ever. But what I'm sorry, I lost sight of the first part of the question.
Yeah, the connection. Have you met? You have the direct exchange with.
Matt. Yeah. Well, direct exchange, of course. He read, as I said, he read the whole manuscript before it was published, and I responded to it. But meeting, unfortunately, 3 times there were actual plans to meet, and the 3 times I fell. At least 2 out of 3 were serious illnesses. One of them was a sciatica that actually I couldn't even walk for 2-3 weeks. So it didn't work, no. Okay. But I would love to meet him one day.
There is one personal note, and if possible, there is reference to Taha as Maulana. Does it say something?
A very high title of respect for me. When I use it for somebody, you can trust that I have the highest respect for that person. in terms of genealogical intellectual genealogy, we come from very different paths, and we happen to meet at one point. This is why I'm interested in his work, and I wrote a book about this. Writing a book is not a simple contribution. It actually, every book you write is going to take 1 vertebrae from your back, and I can count the vertebrae that are going now one by one. So it is not an easy thing to do, but I decided to undertake it, and because I find that he is a great ally. He is probably my best ally in the intellectual world of Islam, and I think there is a lot for me to learn from him. But we come to the subject from different concerns. We have many differences as well, background differences and many other intellectual differences. But as he himself realizes, our spirits are kindred.
Thank you for this testimony in this platform. There's one
Coming
more
to the end,
question the last maybe question from Farouk Ali. He says, what is the authority? I mean, where is the locus of authority in Taha's discourse? That is, by authority, I mean the ethical imperative to which the political subject submits. Is it the Quran or the Sufi Shaykh or the Murshid or the Murabbi?
Is there a difference between any of these?
That's
I mean, if you were to ask Hujwiri or Sarraj about these things, they will tell you, well, I don't see. What do you mean, Quran or the Shaykh or the Al-Insan al-Kamil? Or it's all one thing. It's only the city is the same city, Muhammad. It is only a question of which port, which door you decide to enter the city. Each door will give you a certain view of the city, because every neighborhood in the city and every door and every entry, every street is unique, but it is the same city. And I think that it is, it's all of the above.
One more question from Seda Uzal Khan. She says, sorry, can Taha Abdurrahman's conception of human being be an alternative to the underpinning human conceptions in social sciences to reach alternative social or political theories?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can it be what?
I mean, there is a discussion in social sciences and anthropological circles of the ethical term and the subject and its role and its definition, the renewal, and the work of Talal Hashas and Sabah Mahmoud are examples in this case. And the reference here maybe stems from that background. Can the subject in Taha Abdurrahman's conception of the human play a role of thinking of alternative social sciences and alternative political theories?
Well, there's no other way. It's not just can. If we were to find a way out of the mess we are in now, and we are in a mess, however much some people are living in self-denial, I would say that's the only. It doesn't have to be his vision exactly or mine, but the idea of searching for a different conception of the human subject, a different performativity, a different ethical performance is not just a luxury or some option or possibility. It is the only way for us to exit this situation. The humanities and the sciences and the human sciences and everything in academia, as I have argued in Restating Orientalism, all of this has to be really changed. And the only way you can change it is not by simply creating the Earth Institute at Columbia University and all of these fancy things that just add yet another department. We will call it post-colonialist department, and we pay our debt, so to speak, ethical debt to the problems we have. That is not enough. This is all bandage solutions. The only way to get to the root of the matter is to rethink who we are. And therefore, that's why it makes Foucault for me more and more important. I didn't come to Foucault because people thought he was great. No, I just began to read him, and then the more I read him, I said, okay, my God, this man has something very important to say. I look at others, and I see that he is one of very few who really got his eye on what really is important. It's not just a name. It is much more than that. Now it's a global question.
Thank you very much. I think I am asked by the moderator to end. Do we have time for one more question or no?
I think we've gone over 1 hour, and we have to respect Dr. Hallaq's.
I thank very much Professor Hallaq for his time and exchange. I thank very much Mizan and the Islamic courses for their invitation and for this platform. Thank you. The floor is yours.
My pleasure. My very best to all.
Thank you so much, Professor Hallaq. Keep safe in New York, especially in US, with your great leader you have of the free world, obviously. But everyone, thank you so much for a wonderful session. I really appreciate it. Please, please, please leave your email address if you would like a copy, subject to Dr. Hallaq's permission also. And those who are fasting, please make dua for us whilst you break your fast. Eid Mubarak within a week or so, and the last couple of days of Ramadan, please make dua for us. Thank you so much, Dr. Hallaq. Thank you so much, Dr. Mohammed.
Eid Mubarak to everyone.
Inshallah. And we hope to see you again, and we hope to host you again. And as I said, and I did say, keeping to my promise, I'm hoping to invite yourself and Taha Abdurrahman to London, right? Remember?
Inshallah, when all of this withers.
Yeah. No. So hopefully you'll meet the man himself directly in London, in the belly of the beast, they say, right?
I am sure that if anyone can do it, it is you, Mizan.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, folks. Safe trip. Safe times now, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Bye, everyone.